everyone. We're putting you on mute for now, but please feel free to throw any questions you have throughout this presentation into the chat. I think you should find a chat button on your top bar, and we will get to those as time. We'll make some time in throughout the presentation to revisit questions in the chat, and then at the end, hopefully there'll be time. We can also help folks get off mute if you'd like to ask your question in a non-written form. If you are having any technical difficulties today, we are recording this presentation and we'll be sharing it on the Clean Water Initiative Program YouTube channel. And I'll ask Claire to just share that link to our YouTube channel in the chat so you were able to access that as needed. And with that, welcome to the Clean Water Project Eligibility Screening presentation. So this eligibility screening is a process outlined in the Clean Water Initiative Program State Fiscal Year 23 funding policy. My name is Gianna Petito. I'm the grant supervisor for the Clean Water Initiative Program, and part of my position is to oversee the funding policy development and updates. So the State Fiscal Year 23 funding policy was just recently released in December. It's an update on the State Fiscal Year 21 funding policy. And the Clean Water Project eligibility screening process has changed quite significantly. So this is a training to address that component. And I also want to thank my colleague, Claire Madden, today, who's going to be helping facilitate checking your questions and getting some of those links needed in the chat. This is our agenda for today. We'll start with sharing some links to what might be some helpful materials for you all, either to follow along today or to follow up with later. I'll give a brief overview of who is the Clean Water Initiative Program, or CRIP, and what are clean water projects, a 101 on our funding policy broadly, and then dive into project eligibility and overview of the concept, and then take each criteria, number 1 through 8, step by step, to help you understand the intent behind it and how to check for it and what it means. We'll wrap up with some main takeaways and then have some time, hopefully at the end, for question and answer, but we'll also pause throughout for 1 or 2 questions and invite you at any time to please put your questions in the chat. So if we don't get to them today, we'll make sure we include them in the funding policy Q&A document that is pretty close to being released. So as a quick note as well, this is not a full training on the entire State Fiscal Year 2023 funding policy. And my colleague Claire is sharing links to 2 other trainings we've recently provided on other pieces of the funding policy. One was in January, sort of what are the general changes based on this funding policy compared to the 2021 funding policy. And then there was a March training specifically around reviewing projects through the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And so I recommend accessing those and taking a look there as well. So to start off with, we're on helpful materials. You folks should be able to click the links straight from this slide if you're seeing them, but I'll ask my colleague Claire to share these in the chat as well. These might be helpful to follow along. The first is the CRIP Applicant and Recipient Resources site page. And there's 3 resources to point your attention to there. The first is the actual funding policy. And then underneath it, 2 sub-bullets. Appendix A, the CRIP Project Eligibility Screening Form. And then Appendix B, the CRIP Project Types Table. Appendix A is also in the funding policy, but the separate bullet point is actually a PDF fillable form, so it's useful as a standalone document to work through as well. Appendix B is an Excel file that will be downloaded and open on your computer. The next link down is the Watershed Projects Database, or WPD search tool. After that is a link to the Agency of Natural Resources Atlas, which is an interactive web-based platform available to the public. And an associated PDF, which provides instructions on how to use the ANR Atlas specifically for our grant programs and screening your projects for natural resource impacts. We'll talk through some of these throughout today's presentation. So to start, or to continue, who is CRIP and what are clean water projects? This is our mission statement, our newly minted mission statement over to the left. We as a program aim to efficiently, effectively, and equitably align and coordinate clean water efforts, develop financial and technical resources to implement and sustain projects, and capture and assess and communicate our collective progress and impact of clean water efforts. We are a program within the Water Investment Division in the Department of Environmental Conservation in the Agency of Natural Resources, but who doesn't love a bunch of letters on a page? So I shared all those for you. The Clean Water Initiative also exists in statute. So I have in the bottom left a little snippet of that statute. One of the purposes of the Clean Water Initiative is to provide the financing necessary to achieve and maintain compliance with Vermont's water quality standards. So we're sharing links to our website about the Vermont water quality standards and the statutory language in case you want to learn more. We as a program achieve the intent of the Clean Water Initiative by managing grant programs for what we call clean water projects. What do we mean by that? Well, a bunch of stuff, actually. We're really envisioning a bunch of projects on the landscape that can benefit water quality. And we tend to talk of them in sectors. There might be sort of stormwater sector or the natural resource sector. But it's really a range of practices that can have benefits for water quality. So over on the left, you can see examples of things that treat runoff of rain from roads or parking lots. The top right is a dam removal project, which have benefits for water quality. And the bottom right is a floodplain access project to allow the river to access parts of its floodplain. So we're talking about a lot when we say clean water projects. We support clean water projects through different grant funding programs. So this table is available on our grant opportunities website, and Claire will show the link in the chat. It's a snapshot of that. It's sort of just showing some of our grant funding programs we manage. So the top one is a dam removal program. So it specifically funds dam removal projects. All the way at the bottom, we have a woody riparian buffer planting block grant, specifically funding buffer planting projects. So we fund a range of different funding programs to support these clean water projects. But I'd like to draw your attention to this column that's highlighted in this gorgeous olive color called Funding Program Administrator. What is it? Well, some of you may be familiar with the Ecosystem Restoration Program grants that our program used to facilitate or used to provide out to entities. That's really reflected by line A in this image here. We as a program used to have a call for proposals, review lots of projects, decide, hey, are these projects going to be good for water quality? Do they align with the intent of the Clean Water Fund? We would issue awards and oversee individual projects. As our program has really scaled up in the amount of funding we manage, we've really shifted to the second line relationship where we're relying much more heavily on what we call funding program administrators. These folks independently do calls for proposals, review projects, select the ones, and oversee and make sure that they proceed in alignment with our guidance. This is an important concept to understand when understanding why we have a funding policy, in that because we're no longer independently deciding which projects should get funding and proceed, we're using the funding policy to provide this guidance to our funding program administrators and grantees on the ground. So a quick 101 on our funding policy. Why have a funding policy? Lots of benefits to a funding policy. We started in the most recent State Fiscal Year 23 funding policy. We really expanded on some of this list about why it's in there and some of the intent. This slide shows some purposes of what we hope the funding policy will help us achieve. One of which is really to ensure that the clean water funds that are allocated to our program are used as intended by statute and as intended by the Clean Water Board. We want to make sure that the projects that receive our funding are resulting in the deliverables to help us track and report clean water outcomes back to the legislature and back to the public. We want to make sure we're enhancing equity across fund recipients by standardizing, and that'll also help us expedite granting and contracting efforts. And we also want to minimize any investments in infeasible or low priority projects. So we have a lot of goals that this funding policy is designed to help us achieve. But really the big piece is that we use the funding program administrators and we give them and project managers or proponents an indication through the funding policy which projects are high priority projects, which projects should be funded. Where do I find the funding policy? We already mentioned the bottom link. Again, you should be able to click both these links directly on the presentation today. The bottom link is our grant applicant and recipient resources page. There's the current funding policy. Again, the two appendices A and B, the screening form and the project types table. You can also find the State Fiscal Year 2021 funding policy there. That is still active for some of our block grants and may also be a useful reference for those who are interested. One step up from that, our grants landing page also has the funding policy, along with a summary document of some of the changes between this one and the 2021 policy, a video of that training. And this is where we'll be posting the question and answer document that is forthcoming very shortly. What's in the funding policy? There's a lot in the funding policy. It includes sort of on the top here, information about the Clean Water Initiative, Vermont's water quality goals, how we do tactical basin planning and how it links to, which projects are really high priority projects. Down at the bottom, you'll see there's information about the State Historic Preservation Review of projects, guidance about budget management, expectations for grant recipients. So again, I'm just showing this to say that we're not talking today about all of the funding policy. We're really talking about this highlighted orange box in the middle, this determination of project eligibility. As you can see, it's a huge piece of the policy and it's a lot of work to navigate. So it's hopefully a useful training for you all today to get a better sense of this and some of the changes that have come about since 2021's funding policy. So I'll pause there. Are there any questions pressing right now, or feel free to post them in the chat about the Clean Water Initiative program, clean water projects, or the funding policy? Yeah, Erin.
Hi, this is Erin DeVries from Vermont River Conservancy, and I just have a question about, for those funding program administrators, for example, Watersheds United Vermont, when they put out an RFP, like I think they did yesterday or maybe even today or thereabouts, those project implementers that are going to apply for that funding are just to follow the I guess I'll just say rules and request of WUV rather than, I guess those funding project administrators are the go-to people for project implementers. Is that correct?
They really are. Yeah, they're designed to be, they have a lot of experience. You mentioned WUV with managing a lot of our block grants. We work with them pretty closely. They're connected with the DEC liaison or technical project managers. So they punt questions our way if they can't answer them. And they're designed to really help you understand their materials, our funding policy. We're available as needed too, but we would recommend sort of the folks that are really implementing the projects to really go first to the funding program administrator. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, Gianna.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, we'll move on. And again, please post questions in the chat as they come up. And we're going to give an overview about project this beautiful calming image for this hour-and-a-half training for all of you. Eligibility is the gateway, or at least that's, maybe one way to think about project eligibility. It's really, projects should be determined to be eligible before any funding goes to it from the Clean Water Fund. So it's really, this should be seen as sort of a gateway activity. And it's this is so important to emphasize, so I appreciate you all being here to learn about it today. There's a lot of really fun minutiae we're going to dive into in just a little bit about each criteria, but I just wanted to take a pause and talk about the big picture. Ensuring that all of these proposed projects are vetted for eligibility is really critical towards making sure that the publicly entrusted funds that we administer and that go out the door really meet their original intent. So this criteria has been designed to make sure that all those kind of goals of the funding policy are achieved. That projects that get funded meet the purpose of the Clean Water Fund, that projects that are funded are going to result in the impacts that we need to report back to the public and the legislature. Like, this is really the mechanism we use to meet all of those goals. And the success of this is the success of us being able to rely on funding program administrators really relies on the successful use of this project eligibility process, so that we can continue to outsource our decision making in a way that the public can continue to rely on. In this new funding policy, there's 8 criteria. There's been quite a change from the State Fiscal Year 21 funding policy in terms of how the criteria are worded. We've put a lot of work on this update to also make a clearer yes/no decision point per criteria, and also a clearer decision maker per criteria. Hopefully you have open at this point the Appendix A CRIP project eligibility screening form, and this is really designed to be a companion document. The funding walks through each criteria, explains some of the reasoning, explains some of the content, but the screening form, the Appendix A screening form, is really sort of where you fill out the yes, no, where you fill out the information for every project to cross-check with the eligibility. So it's really a tool to be used by everyone. And as a side note, this screening form is not actually, it's not new. It was a product specifically for our design implementation block grant, because that really was our major block grant that was funding a ton of design and implementation projects. But with the passage of Act 76, we have a lot more funding programs, at least 3, that are now funding design and implementation. So we've moved this screening form to the funding policy so it can be standardized across all the funding programs. A lot of us share roles in this, in the success of project eligibility screening and making sure that these public funds are spent as intended. Typically, it's a project implementer, someone who's going to oversee the project that's initially filling out this form, the screening form on Appendix A. They're the ones that might be talking to landowners and getting a letter of landowner support. They're the ones probably talking to permitting staff at the state. They really know the details of the project and are likely the folks boots on the ground filling out the form. Funding program administrators are required to include the form when they put out a call for proposals. It's required solicitation material for them to use. They should hold on to the material as sort of backup documentation, and they should review the form to confirm that the project is eligible. Look at the answers being proposed. There's some sections where it sort of relies on the funding program administrator to make a judgment as to whether the justification provided feels satisfactory. And so there's definitely a role expected of the funding program administrators to look at the eligibility screening form and make some decisions. The DEC technical project manager may periodically review or audit the performance of funding program administrators and ask to look at these forms, or if questions come up about a specific project, maybe why it got funded. This is a time where a TPM, a technical project manager, may get involved and ask to see the documentation on file. And then all of our colleagues across the Agency of Natural Resources and some folks over at the Natural Resources Board, they're all supporting project implementers and the rest of our staff in reviewing these projects and providing input too. So there's a lot of people involved. When does screening happen? Ideally, iteratively over time, part of a paid scope of work for an entity. For example, the MS4 community formula grants. This is a step within the scope of work for the MS4 communities to first complete project eligibility screening of projects they might want to pursue. It's also part of project development block grants, asking folks who receive money to develop projects to maybe screen for eligibility and answer some of those questions. It's designed that way or intended that way to give folks time to do this and to maybe have their time covered with funding. If it doesn't happen then, it's probably happening when a call for proposals has gone out the door from a funding program administrator. It's at that point where an entity might have a project they know they want to receive funding for, and then they need to fill out the project eligibility screening form. And then they have to go do all the steps of that, which might be talking to permitting staff, getting landowner letters of support. So while there's an ideal piece of it happening over time, there's also the reality that it may not always be happening over time. And so this is probably a point I'll come back to again and again, is that project eligibility does take time. And if it is happening during a project solicitation round, to ask funding program administrators to allow for that time. You know, if you have to go to a town select board, you may not get the agenda for a couple different meetings, and that's a month and a half in. So there's definitely some things that need time baked in. And then the last thing to note before we dive into each criteria, we received a couple questions on this in our question and answer that will be addressed in our question and answer. So I wanted to mention it. Certain criteria don't actually apply to all project phases or types. What do we mean by that? We also sometimes have funding clustered by the phase of the project. So over on the left, this first image sort of represents assessment work or project ID work, where we have folks go out and walk streams or drive on roads and look for opportunities that might for projects. And the next two vertical pictures is sort of representing this idea of project development. So we have a block grant that supports project development work, which talks about like taking a project idea and then figuring out the feasibility, maybe talking to the landowner, figuring out permitting needs, figuring out what might be needed to get it ready for a design. The next two images kind of represent design work. We have a design implementation block grant, for example, where you might start to get an engineer involved. The designs get increasingly complex. The top right image is demonstrating we fund obviously implementation of these projects. And then in some of our programs, the bottom right, we fund maintenance of these projects too. But the text that snapshot here is from the funding policy, and it talks about projects that are asking for funding for assessment work, ID, or development only have to meet eligibility criteria 2, 3, 6, and 8. So that's what that means, mostly because the other criteria, it takes time to get to that, and they're not ready yet for that information. So just wanted to make a mention of that there, and we'll return to this idea of project phases in a little bit. Questions on project eligibility overview before we go through each criteria?
This is Erin again. Sorry, I don't know if you can see that hand raised. But I just want to confirm, Gianna, you mentioned 5 projects, well, actually 6: assessment, project ID, project development, design, implementation, and maintenance. And you were saying in that last slide that assessment, project ID, and project development only need to complete criteria 2, 3, 6, and 8. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. And along with that, Erin, when we get into the project types table, I would point out we have a lot of guidance about what we mean by an assessment. So we fund certain types of assessments. For example, we fund stormwater master plans, and we have a scope of work and specific deliverables that we expect from that. Only some funding programs can fund stormwater master plans. Others cannot. For example, the enhancement, development, design, and implementation block grant can't fund assessment or ID work. It just funds project development, design, and implementation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. Here's the fun part. Eligibility criteria 1 through 8. Strap in. And we'll stop at the end of each of these because there's a lot of information, particularly criteria 2, 3, and 4. There's a lot to touch on. In particular, I strongly recommend having the screening form open because we'll be sharing snapshots of it as we work through each criteria on the screen as well to help you feel oriented. So to start off with eligibility criteria number 1, what is the purpose of the project? For those of you who are real groupies of CRIP, you might remember that in the old funding policy, each project to be eligible had to have a primary purpose of sediment and nutrient removal to be eligible. With the passage of Act 76, there were new grant programs that were recommended that didn't really have a primary focus on nutrient and sediment removal, namely the enhancement grant program. As a result, we had to rethink broadly what makes a project eligible for clean water funding. And through some consultations with stakeholders, landed on it must address at least one of the 4 objectives of Vermont's surface water management strategy. So the screening form has sort of a drop down. You can pick one of these, you can pick multiple, and then enter in if it's more than one. These are pretty broad, as you can see here. It needs to meet at least one of these. This is a self-attestation. We really just ask that a funding program administrator is looking at what's being proposed and seeing that there's a reasonable link. So you're not necessarily proposing to host a circus visit in town and saying that it'll have a benefit for water quality. Any questions on eligibility criteria 1 before we move on to eligibility criteria 2? Okay, so moving on to 2, this might be deceptive in that it's only really a couple sentences in the funding policy, but it's actually asking folks to do quite a bit of I guess, fact checking or confirmation to really make sure that the project is eligible. Deliverables as defined in the Clean Water Project Types table, and it's not listed as ineligible as an activity or a project type. So that's actually a lot of stuff that's really baked into this table 2A as well. So the first chunk is about the project types table. So this, if you don't already have the Excel open, I'd recommend opening up the Excel, which is Appendix D project types table, and we'll dive into each of these separately there. And again, you can find Appendix B projects types table at our applicant recipient resources page. Thank you, Claire, for sharing the link there. And I've highlighted the Appendix B, where to download it. And this project types table lists all of these pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the project type, the funding program, the descriptions and standards, performance measures, milestones, deliverables. So we'll walk through each of these for you to understand what this one sentence is bundling together. So the first is project type. You'll see these sort of themed by sector. You'll see like stormwater projects and road projects and lakeshore projects. The project type usually also includes information about the project phase. So you'll see a lot of ones where it's like stormwater preliminary engineering, stormwater final engineering, stormwater implementation. So the project type can indicate both the sector of work as well as the phase that applies there. Column 2 is the funding program. This is new for funding policy, the new funding policy. This is listing what grant programs fund this project type. So for example, final engineering design can be funded with the water quality restoration formula grants that clean water service providers have, the enhancement design development and implementation block grant. Ooh, there's a lot of alphabet here. The MS4 community formula grant and the old design implementation block grant. So as an example, if you wanted to propose to install a rain garden, you really can't ask the Woody Buffer block grant to fund that because it is not, even though stormwater project, it's not with the applicable funding program. If you don't know what this alphabet soup is, there's a little snapshot on the top of the screen of a table in Appendix C of the funding policy, which lists the acronym and then what funding program we're actually talking about. So a way to reference that back. The third column is definitions and minimum standards. So this is asking folks that if you're proposing to do a stormwater design, does it actually meet this definition? Is it a tier 1 or tier 2 practice that's listed in the stormwater management manual? Is it actually going to collect, store, infiltrate, and filter runoff? Or are you really kind of proposing some gray infrastructure that's not really an eligible thing for these clean water funds? So we're asking that project proponents familiarize themselves with these definitions and say, yeah, this is what we're proposing to do. It meets this definition. We've included a lot more links in this column for folks to reference the resources provided. For example, for the lakeshore practices, we reference a bioengineering manual and/or as approved by Lakes program staff. So it's really a useful place to know, what do we mean by a stormwater project type? What is that? The fourth column is performance measures. So these are something that we report out. This is part of our report back to the legislature, back to the public annually, where we count number of designs completed, 100% design completed, preliminary designs completed, acres treated, acres planted. So if someone is asking for funding for a final engineering design, they should result in a final design. We have definitions of design phases also in Appendix D of the funding policy to learn more about what that means. And as a side note, final design is also kind of 90% here, but you can refer to the upcoming pending Q&A document for that clarification. The fifth column is milestones. So these are steps in a scope of work. So what this means is that someone who's asking for funding for final engineering design, the funding program administrator should bake these milestones into a sub-agreement with them and make sure that these things happen. We've worked hard to kind of cut back on the milestones and deliverables over time and really kind of get it down to the bare bones. But these are expectations that these things should be completed. Bolded words are also listed in Appendix C of the funding policy. So if you look at a word and you're like, what the heck does that mean? The funding policy has links and resources to explain what this is as well. And then finally, deliverables. These are the tangible products expected. At the very least, they're kept on file with the funding program administrator and with the project implementer, the sub-grantee recipient. Sometimes those things also get submitted to DEC. As example, we tend to want the final design plans of stormwater projects as implemented to help with follow-up verification visits. We do have folks upload into our database the pre and post photos of a site during the implementation phase. So there are some deliverables that get sent to DEC. There's clarification of which of those get sent to us in your individual grant agreements. So that's kind of the top part of this table. Table 2A is asking folks to go through and say, okay, which project, if it is an eligible project type, which is it? And this is a drop down where you can pick it from the Appendix B. The next question again is asking, is it eligible for the funding program you're applying for? Again, does it meet the definitions? And then result in the performance measures, milestones, and deliverables. So it does look like just 4 questions, but it really is asking a lot of folks to just cross-check with that project types table to confirm. And then the last piece is about the ineligible projects list. On page 10 of the funding policy, if ineligible, here's just a couple of examples, like projects treating stormwater from expanded impervious surface. So even if it's a tier 1 or tier 2, if it's in, treating new impervious surface, it wouldn't be eligible. Stream bank hard armoring or riprapping, like this image is demonstrating, not eligible. So this is an example of some of these things. These are sort of evolved through time, through funding different projects and requests to remove things from the eligibility list. What that means, though, just to refer back to this table, is that there may be times when what a project proponent is asking for may be on the ineligible list, but they can provide a justification here. A clear example is this projects that can be wholly funded through other grant sources. The idea here is to, preserve these funds for things that couldn't otherwise be funded. And some examples are usually if the project can be funded from the Agency of Transportation, like it's a municipal roads project, Agency of Transportation should probably be funding that. Or if it's an agricultural project, the Agency of Agriculture should probably be funding that. But there may be situations where that other funding source is ill-suited, not enough money, and justification can be provided. So this table provides space for that justification. And again, the funding program administrator is asked to review that and consider where they feel that is a satisfactory justification.
Hey, Gianna, we have a
Yes.
question in the chat and one hand raised before you move on to the next criteria, if that's okay.
Great timing. I was going to see if
Okay.
there were questions. So who's first, Claire?
Right. Arabella asked, I heard Gianna mention QUISPs are among the possible funding programs, but scrolling through the column in the project types table, I don't recognize any of the acronyms associated with WICs and QUISPs. What am I missing?
Sure. Formula is the word. Probably not super helpful since we've also decided that MS4 program would be a formula grant, but formula is the word referencing the Clean Water Service provider funding. And again, Appendix C, that table will help you make that reference.
And Hillary has asked, what about NRCS funds for forestry projects?
Same idea. I think there's a footnote that specifically talks about forestry projects going to NRCS, ag projects going to NRCS or the Agency of Ag. I think it's a footnote on the bottom of page 10 or 11 to check. But again, we've updated the funding policy to be a little bit more lenient, to recognize that sometimes that funding is insufficient or poorly timed. Maybe there won't be another grant round for a year and a half. So asking folks to just explain why they can't use that funding instead, and asking funding program administrators to, save that documentation and decide whether it's justifiable. Other questions, Claire?
Yeah, Dan has his hand raised.
Yeah, quick question, and maybe it's more clear in the funding policy, but when you're talking about it, the phrase in the previous slide about can it be covered by another type of funding source, you're really referring mostly to the usual suspects of state funds or perhaps NRCD. You're not talking about like, well, wait a minute, did you apply for a basin plan grant or a Corps of Engineer grant or a U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant or a We Love the Environment grant? You're really talking about,
exactly. We're not asking folks to turn up every rock and to demonstrate that they've, we don't want it to be a burdensome request, but it is a request to preserve this funding for what's most appropriate. So we do list in that footnote probably the biggest players that also report to our program. So.
Thanks for that clarification.
Sure. Any other pressing ones, Claire, or can we save the rest of them for the end?
Yeah, there's just one more. Can you talk a little bit about how projects that are required or partially required by a permit can or can't be eligible for?
Sure. I'll actually get to that in the eligibility criteria number 8. But in the past, under our current or older block grants, projects that were required by a permit or driven by a permit just had a match requirement. Under our new funding paradigm, as a result of Act 76 of 2019, several new funding programs have a requirement that projects have to be voluntary or mostly voluntary. For example, the Clean Water Service provider formula grants and the Water Quality Enhancement block grant have to be voluntary projects. For community formula grant is doing also regulatory projects. Those are required by the MS4 permit. So it's sort of project grant program dependent. Hopefully that answers it, but we can invite you to come off mute during the Q&A if we want to dive into that further. So I'm going to go over to Eligibility Criteria 3, the Watershed Projects Database. This criteria requires projects to both have a Watershed Projects Database or WPD ID and to have it for the correct project phase. So there's these little green rectangles. The top rectangle is showing the ID number for this project in Pittsford. And then the bottom rectangle is showing the project type is stormwater. And again, the project type indicates the phase, which is implementation. So just to take a quick step back, what is the Watershed Projects Database? What are we even talking about here? Thank you, Claire, for sharing a link. You can learn more at this link about it. But briefly, it's a database that is developed by different agency, the Agency of Digital Services, and it's used by our department to manage a variety of clean water projects across the state. So the picture on the left is sort of a insider view snapshot of an example project from our perspective and what we see. And I'm just showing it to you to show that there's a lot of information gathered in the database about each of these individual projects. So for example, this project, there's an ID number up top and a name, and all these little tabs, project, events, measures, gather information about the project location, the basin, the town, the partners. Events is funding information. Measures is performance measures. So once a project is complete, that's where we document acres treated or numbers of designs completed. This BMP tab, which is highlighted, is where we gather all the structural information. For example, if it's a stormwater project or a riparian buffer planting, sort of the nuts and bolts of the practice so that we can estimate phosphorus reduction. So these are all really important pieces of information that then feed other things that we're required to do. So our program, we use this to track all the CRIP funded projects. The Watershed Planning Program uses the database to track prospective clean water projects identified through the basin planning process. And a lot of this information feeds and supports other products. For example, the Clean Water Initiative Performance Report here that Claire did a fantastic job spearheading this year and leads the development of, gathers all this information about clean water funding, not just from our program, but from state and federal programs across the state. But it does pull for our program from the database information about what are the performance measures, what did we achieve, how much money did we put in. It also supports information like that we would need for like the cost allocation methodology for the formula grants. Because there's information here by ID number, we know the project phase, we know how much money was spent on it. We can start to estimate on average, what does it cost to do a stormwater design, a buffer planting per acre, things like that. So this is really important information for that. And it also supports public facing, oh, a page not found error, I'm sorry. Arabella, hopefully we can get a better link for you. But it also supports public-facing maps as well by way of the another database. For example, this map on the right is the Clean Water Project Explorer, where folks can actually see implemented or proposed projects, a visual representation of what's in the database. So going back to the requirement, it's probably relatively simple to understand that a project needs to have an ID number, but what do we mean by an ID number for a specific phase? We've already talked about project phases with that picture, that slide with all the images, but here's another representation of this idea of projects moving from what we would call assessment and ID over through different design phases to implementation, and how theoretically their ID numbers should change as they go through the phases. For example, you could see a stormwater master plan for Rainy Boots, Vermont. That's a project, that's an assessment project. It has its own ID number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That assessment project identified a potential rain garden at the library and recommended 100% design for that. That would get its own WPD ID 1111-221. Proposed for funding, great, gets funding for 100% design. The design's complete. Now they're recommending funding for implementation. Implementation phase should get a different WPD ID 11222. This is a really common error. That's why I'm mentioning it. Most people, if they're already sort of shepherding a project through, might use the same ID number them separated. It's important for us to maintain the granularity of data of funding and costs per phase so that we can continue to get an accurate depiction of what it costs by project type and by project phase. And we use the WPDID to make those calculations. Maybe that's more insider baseball than everyone wants to know, but it's a really important thing and why we ask for both of those pieces. How do you check for your WPDID and if it's for the correct phase? There is a Watershed Projects Database search tool, the link Claire's going to share. You may just want to know if your project even exists in the database, so you could type in, maybe unique words associated with the project that you could put in the name search box here that might pop it up. You could search by town or basin. You might also want to talk to the watershed planner of your area to see like, hey, do you know about this thing? And see if they can help you find whether it already exists. If you do have a WPDID, you can put it in the project ID, the very last box on the bottom right there, and search for it. And then you can look at some of the project details to see whether it's actually for the right phase. So if you click on the project details, green rectangles, this kind of thing pops up and you can check status. If the status is completed, that's a good clue. It's probably not the project you're applying for funding for, or there might be an error in the database. Again, you can check project type, and that second half of that project type usually indicates the phase. If you do think there's an error, you can look at the lat long and description and say, well, it is the right lat long, it is the right description, but it's not complete yet. And then you can talk to your watershed planner about making some corrections in the database. But this is a tool to use for you to answer this question of does it have an ID number and does it have it for the correct phase? If you don't have an ID number, this is how you get one. Other than talking to the planner, there's actually an online form. The Clean Water Project New Project form. Thank you, Claire, for sharing the link to that. This is the baseline information that the form will ask you for: the title, the type, the description, the location, and the watershed. Your watershed planner will then review this and assign an identification number. If it's a complex project, we recommend you talk to your watershed planner first. They may want to sort of learn more about what you're proposing. They may say, hey, it's already in the database, or they may say, oh, I don't know about that. Or if you're proposing to do a lot of in-stream work, they may want to know what the river scientist has said about that. So if this is not already in the database, there might be some work you need to do and talk to some other staff at DEC to gauge their thoughts on it so that the watershed planner feels fully informed when making a decision and giving you a database ID number. Okay. Questions on eligibility criteria number 3.
I don't see any in the chat.
Great. Okay. All right, this is the last meeting one. Oh, did I just see a hand go up? Or maybe I didn't. Oh yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I've noticed that some of the projects in the projects database that have been uploaded by either myself or some of my partners have been completed. How can they be updated to say they've been completed? Can we do that, or does somebody else do that?
Great question, Jim. Right now, somebody else does that. In the future, hopefully you'll be able to do that. It also depends on how it was funded. So if your project was completed with funding from our program, our program requires as one of the deliverables this project closeout form. And the closeout form asks you all the information that we want to put into the database, like the performance measures completed, all of the structural information, like if it's a stormwater practice. That right now is getting manually entered into the database and then marked as complete. But there's a delay there because particularly if you're being funded by a block grant, you might have completed your project a year ago. Then it gets to the block grant holder, then they report to us a year later, then we need some time to enter it. So there's certainly a lag in getting that updated. We're working really hard to try and get it updated as quickly as we can. In the future, this project closeout form is actually going to turn into an A&R online form. So that would automatically update the database. You would enter the same information about your performance measures, but it would automatically be able to edit it into complete. And we are going to ask the funding program administrators to do a quality control check on that information, but hopefully will be a smoother and more immediate process. In the meantime, though, if you do see errors, certainly feel free to flag them for your planners, and as capacity allows, we'll try to progress with them, particularly ones that are not funded through a program. We don't gather that information, so it's really helpful to hear that. We can flag that as such.
Well, that was my next question. I've entered in a lot of projects recently in the last few days that were riparian buffer plantings. And they were through funds that I got through other organizations. And I just submitted those in the last few days. Some of them are completely done, but they've never been in the database before. So, apparently, I guess, even though they look like they're in progress, some of them are completely done. So that's why I'm asking this question.
Great, thanks, Jim. Yeah, we definitely know that the status of them are not as updated as we would like. If they were never in the database and you got them funded elsewhere and then they're complete, depending, we have other funders that ultimately report to us that get captured in the statewide performance report that we report to the legislature. So the Watershed Projects database is mostly the stuff that we fund. We may capture your information, like the Lake Champlain Basin Program is definitely a major funder that reports to us as well. So I would chat offline, Jim, if there's certain concerns you have, and we can try to make sure that we're at least capturing that information. And thank you so much for your great work doing all those buffer plantings.
Thanks.
Okay, so moving on to eligibility criteria number 4, the last really meaty one, I promise. So this is called the Natural Resource Impacts Criteria, and the project is eligible for this or meets the eligibility of this criteria if it is reasonably considered permittable by all applicable A&R and Natural Resource Board permitting programs, or the project proponent sufficiently demonstrates how it will be permittable. The guidance for how to go through this process, this is again a short paragraph in the funding policy, but if you go to Appendix A, the project eligibility screening form, step 4 has a lot of more guidance about how you would go through this. And step 4 also mentions that if, say, for example, a project is asking for 100% design funding, but they already did the permitting assessment work to get the 30% design funding and nothing's really changed, they can submit, prior permit need assessments documentation in lieu of redoing Table 4, as long as sort of all those topics are still addressed in it. Easement and riparian buffer plantings are also excluded from eligibility criteria 4, and those are mentioned in the funding policy. So to take a step back on this one, and this one has gone through several iterations and again is quite new in this funding policy, the way that this is being structured. The issue is that clean water projects can still have an impact on the state's natural resources. A very classic example is green stormwater infrastructure being placed smack dab in the middle of a wetland. And we want to avoid putting public dollars into a project with sort of blinders on and just focusing mostly on clean water if it might come at the detriment of other natural resources. So the underlying assumption of this criteria is that our permitting programs are really established to mitigate the project impacts to natural resources. That's why all these permitting programs exist. So the conclusion really is if the project's considered permittable or likely to get a permit, it's most likely going to be avoiding or mitigating these natural resource impacts, so it's eligible for funding. So that's just the flow of logic behind this criteria. There's 3 parts to it, and we'll talk through each of them. The first is desktop review, and this is where we would refer to Table 4 in the Appendix A eligibility screening form. So this table 4 is kind of grouped by theme or regulatory program, and then asks some initial questions about your project, yes/no questions. And some of the questions are about the location of your project. For example, this one highlighted is your project located within 1 mile of a mapped significant natural community or rare, threatened, or endangered species? Another example is any portion of your project site within a perennial river or stream channel? And there's this tiny little footnote. These footnotes provide links to how you would determine that. So this is where the mapping tools come in. This is where you'll see a link to the A&R Atlas. You may also see a link in there to this PDF that we mentioned, the instructions on how to use the A&R Atlas. The instruction document is a couple years old. We're still tracking down the editable Word version, but it's pretty close to accurate about the imagery, how to use the different layers, how to turn them on, and check that your project isn't or isn't located in like a floodplain or in a wetland or in a river channel. So this is a very helpful guide to answering any of those questions about whether your project is located in an area that might trigger permitting review. Big picture, look at the footnotes. The footnotes provide links, I guess, is the main point there. Other questions ask you more about the nature of your project and not the location. For example, stormwater permits are less concerned about the location and more concerned about the area of disturbance. And so you might see a question like, will the project disturb more than an acre of land, as an example? So either way, if it's about the location of your project or what your project's proposing to do, if you're answering yes to these, then you want to drop down and follow up with the people that you might need to follow up with. So if yes, these tables then provide who you would need to contact. So for example, if the yes to stormwater, you'd want to talk to a stormwater specialist, and you can use this link, the Water Quality Project Screening Tool, to find out who you need to talk to. So this is a pop-up of what that looks like. You would pop in your Latin long of your project, and this really handy-dandy dot and map of where your project is located would show up, including, the basin that your project is located in, your watershed, your town, who your non-regulatory contacts are, like your watershed planner and your river scientists, who some of the regulatory contacts are, like your stormwater analyst. So again, the table is really packed full of links and tools to help you answer any of these questions, hopefully as simply as possible. So the next step is, once you've gone through table 4 and you determined if you need to talk to anyone who you should reach out to, you then need to reach out to them and chat with them. So this is sometimes called a pre-application review or a pre-permit screening. This is not a permitting decision. I'll say it again, this is not a permitting decision. You're not asking staff for a permitting decision. You're asking them to assist with a funding decision. We really just want to make sure we're not paying for projects that then can't ultimately get permits. So again, step 4 in the screening form has this text on there, and it provides instructions about what information you might want to give to the permitting staff. And if they request more information, that might be helpful. And then what to say to the permitting staff when you send this information over to them. We highlight this in yellow. Again, this is new in this new funding policy. We've done an internal training with the permitting staff. We'll try to do another one soon. But we also ask folks out there who are project implementers to reiterate that you're not asking for a permitting decision. Reiterate and be clear about what you're asking for and why. So hopefully we can get some good, strong answers from them. And give them time to respond, particularly during field season. They may need upwards of 30, 45 days to have some desk time to look at your project and give you some thoughts on it. And then the last piece is a summary, a response summary from the project proponent. If you're a project proponent asking for information from a permitting staff, you're not likely, or you may not always get just a yes or no, it's going to need a permit, it won't need a permit. You maybe get some answers like, yeah, it'll need a permit, it's probably good, but you should probably move that thing like 6 inches to the left, or no, you can't get a permit with that, but if you change this material, then it's permittable. Or I can't tell you if you need a permit. I need to do a site visit in the field season to tell you whether there's a wetland there. So you may just get a lot of information that we recommend you document and write down. And then this step is sort of you summarizing what information you've gotten from the permitting staff. So there's a tiny little spot in this gray block, but also says maybe just attach this information, what's needed or what might be needed, what was voiced by the permitting staff, and then how are you as a project proponent going to address this? So for example, if a permitting staff says, I can't tell you if a permit's needed, I need to go out and do a field visit. Maybe you as a project proponent say, wetlands needs to do a field visit. We've baked this into our proposed milestones. Then the funding program administrator will review this and determine whether it's reasonable and reasonably considered permittable. So that was a lot. Questions on eligibility screening number 4.
Nothing in the chat, Gianna.
I know this is a lot to absorb for folks too, if it's your first time kind of really digesting this. So certainly welcome questions in the chat as they come to you. So moving on to eligibility criteria 5 through 8. These are much shorter yes/no questions. So hopefully we can run through these pretty quickly and leave some more time for questions at the end. So I'll run through these now. And they're all, as you can see, kind of, baked into a single 5A here. Eligibility criteria 5 is landowner and operation and maintenance responsible party support. You need to identify and demonstrate commitment from a qualified and willing operation and maintenance responsible party, and also demonstrate that the landowner is in support of the project for the currently proposed phase. Please don't ask for money for implementation if you only have a letter of support for 30% design, because it's not really clear that the landowner has even seen the more recent designs, still support the project. For earlier phase projects, tentative commitment is okay. You don't even have funding for 30% design yet. Who might be a good maintenance responsible party? Maybe it's the town. Can you get a letter from them saying they're willing to consider it but want to be involved as the design progresses? Just showing that this engagement has happened and that folks are thinking about maintenance ahead of time is really important. These landowners were so supportive, they did their own planting with their baby on their back. This was a great, someone, maybe a grantee on this call, submitted this photo. Thank you so much, it's fantastic. There are some requirements on the use of funds, which we call eligibility criteria 6 budget. So some funds can't be used for things like political advocacy or operational permit fees or impact fees. So there's a list here to check in the funding policy. And what this means is that funding program administrators should be seeing budgets and reviewing them and making sure that subgrants are not spending their money inappropriately. There's a criteria about required leverage. It really only applies to the MS4 community formula grants. We have a separate question and answer session with you all or them all next week. So I'm just going to breeze over this and say we'll dive deeper into it, but we have just broadened what we consider leverage. And there's some guidance in Appendix C of the funding policy about how to document leverage. And then eligibility criteria number 8 is new with this funding policy, and this is program-specific, funding program-specific eligibility. So as mentioned earlier, we tried to do criteria 1 through 7 as it would apply to all funding programs under the funding policy. And then criteria 8 is sort of the uniqueness of each funding program. So here's a table of just some examples where the MS4 community formula grant, the project also has to be listed in the phosphorus control plan or flow restoration plan or integrated water quality plan. That's not a requirement for any other grant program. That's why it's sort of its own criteria. Under the enhancement, development, design, implementation block grant, all projects also have to meet one of the statutorily defined purposes for water quality enhancement grants. So in the funding policy, we made links or refer folks to where they could find more information about what the specific eligibilities are per funding program. And funding program administrators, like Erin, your question earlier, are a great first stop too for people who want to advance projects to chat with them about any further information if it's unclear. Another example might be, oh, sorry, I'll stop here and say there's one more page on the screening form that's only applicable for formula grants under the Clean Water Service Provider, which is related to ag projects, agricultural projects. We've done a separate training on this, and we have a recorded training from the Agency of Ag. I have to track the link to it. I'm sorry it's not available right now, but that last page does not need to be of concern to anyone that's applying for other grants or using other grants. Questions on eligibility criteria 5 through 8? Okay. All right, great. Oh, right on time, 15 minutes left. So the main takeaways, eligibility screening is a gateway. It is the really key gateway of our collective effort to ensure the success of our design of using funding program administrators and making sure that funding is still being spent as intended by statute, as intended by the Clean Water Board, resulting in the reportable milestones and deliverables. This is really the tool, this is the crux, and so we really appreciate you all taking the time today to learn more about it. It's really important and it can be quite complex. I hope that one of your takeaways is that the funding policy, the eligibility screening form, Appendix A, the project types table, which is Appendix D, are all very key resources to familiarize yourself with if you're going to be a frequent flyer of clean water funding. Staff from our program, CRIP, as well as the technical project manager and the funding program administrator are available for support. And eligibility screening takes time. Project proponents may need help. Thank you. So that concludes our presentation. Claire will just share our program site page again and our link to our grants notification. If you're not already on it, to learn more about upcoming grants and opportunities. And I'll stop there. And is there anything in the chat, Claire? And if not, we can start to invite folks to unmute themselves.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Any questions on any of that? Hillary.
Could you just flip back to the slide that shows number 6? I got interrupted and missed that one.
The budget?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Sure. And this is, sorry, Hillary, these are not the only budget ineligible things. This is just a couple of examples, but refer you to the funding policy under that criteria to see all of them.
So budget ineligible things. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Or needs to be eligible items.
Right. And so going back to the table, budget includes ineligible expenses. Answer must be no to proceed is the screening question. Any other questions? Yeah, Allison.
Hi. I don't want to be too hung up on the permit question, but I just want some clarity about who is supposed to flag if a project is required by a permit.
If a project is required by a permit. So I would say it kind of falls under this question 8. Does it meet the additional program eligibility? It would probably be a good idea for funding program administrators to list out those questions based on their funding program. So for example, if someone's applying to the enhancement block grant, it's probably a good question to say, like, which of the 5 statutory goals are you trying to meet? And is your project non-regulatory? And so that's where the review or the flag would happen, is that the funding program administrator, because they're that's where they would see whether it's like what their justification is that it's non-regulatory.
Okay.
It certainly relies on I guess honesty in the system. There certainly could be a bad actor saying this is totally voluntary and the funding program administrator doesn't have any further context. So if there are you know, I think if there's scenarios like that, Allison, coming from the Lakes program, you're hearing about projects where you know they want funding, but you know it's permit driven and you want to flag that for any of the DEC technical project managers, like we can help communicate that as a flag too, back to the funding program administrators.
Yeah,
That's
it
probably more
did
on a case by
happen.
case basis. Yeah.
It did happen earlier this spring, and I don't think that there was anything at the time on that application about it needing to be voluntary. And then the project was also, I would say, 80% regulatory, 20% voluntary. So is there a way to apply for just the parts of a project that are non-regulatory if there is a regulatory component?
Again, I think that depends on the program. Our current design and implementation block grant, depending on where this individual project you're talking about applied to, didn't have it that it had to be non-regulatory. We also, based on funding program, give a little bit further guidance about that division. For example, with the clean water service providers, there is an opportunity to pay for the sort of above and beyond the regulatory component. That's just like newly minted Chapter 6 guidance. That's is it still open for public comment? Or no, I think we just
No.
finished closed public comment for that. So yeah, I don't know if that's totally answering your question, Allison, but I think it does depend on the program. Whereas in the enhancement grant one, there's not really that that leeway in terms of you can do a little bit more.
Okay.
The enhancement grant program, the block grant program, also was developed with a bunch of stakeholders as part of the Act 76 steering committee. It was a subgroup, and so we got a lot of public comment throughout development of the enhancement block grant, and we developed a summary document which provides guidance. But that may evolve over time as questions like that arise. I don't know. There's some information that things need to be non-regulatory, but the definition of that is not super defined currently in the enhancement grant summary document. So I'm sure there will be more questions that need further grant program specific definition that will evolve over time.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Let me pull up the chat. I see that one. What are the main regulatory programs that apply to projects? Yeah, there certainly are some folks who would apply for like stormwater assistance under a lot of these stormwater permits. There's other instances where it's might be like an impact fee, so it's not necessarily a program so much as someone's impacted a wetland and then they have to go restore another wetland and pay for that. So there's sometimes it's sort of case by case, but it's a great recommendation, Lynn, and we can mull over the best way to clarify that for folks. And for other folks who are listening, there's also, oh, go ahead, Lynn.
No, I was just going to say some of those that you were mentioning, impact fees, people could probably self-report on better, but as people are looking to explore different projects, I was thinking that some just automatically, we see the 3-acre permit being the one that comes up the most often, and searching that 3-acre permit list is a good way of just giving an indication of whether a project happens to fall in a 3-acre parcel or not. That was
Yeah.
just a recommendation, because I think Allison was asking like whether, how you would know, and that's a good like initial screen. It doesn't cover everything, but it might be a good screen.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lynn. I think Allison, you're also talking you might be talking a bit more about like that case by case scenario with the Lakeshore too, and some of those permits, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I'm talking about an example of where a project came across my desk that was mostly required by a permit and was applying for funding. And I don't know that the person applying even knew that it had to be a non-regulatory. I don't think it was on the application form.
Got it.
So that was the issue.
Thanks, Allison. Great recommendation, Lynn. And I just wanted to flag for folks who are listening who maybe there's sometimes a confusion or distinction that if a project needs a permit, that it's regulatory. And what we're talking about here, a lot of our projects need permits. That's why we have step 4. It's okay if your project needs a permit as long as it's going to get the permit. For example, if you want to remove a berm on the side of a stream so that the stream can access its floodplain, that's likely going to need maybe a stream alt permit, maybe a local zoning permit. That's okay. That's still an eligible project. If you're doing that because you got in trouble and you're obliged to do that project for some reason, that's then a regulatory project. So it's more about the reason driving the project. If it's and that gets confusing with stormwater, that entities and different properties have stormwater permits that they need to meet the obligations of, which is like treating the rainwater that goes onto those properties. They have to meet the obligations of that permit. That permit is driving that need. So then some grant programs that we manage can't then fund the stormwater practice on their property. Before I conclude, can I remind everyone of the gorilla in the room of VDHP review? Sure, Dan, I'm happy to mention it. I also don't want it to get confused with project eligibility screening. We very intentionally made sure that Vermont Division of Historic Preservation Review is not part of the eligibility screening because it's already pretty weighty and can take some time. And Division of Historic Preservation Review might also take some time. So please, if you haven't already, review the March 8th training. The link is provided in the chat earlier on about Vermont Division Historic Preservation Review. Also the section of the funding policy about it. This is new for our program to provide much clearer guidance around this. It just, over time, we were hearing questions about when their review happened, and reading into it, learned it really does apply because this is state funding, and all state funding this would apply to. So we've worked really hard to try and give as clear guidance as we can on that, but certainly thanks for the flag, Dan, and recommend folks get up to speed on that as well. Okay, well, we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. That was a long presentation. Everyone else listening, I hope you watch this on 2.5 speed or whatever, just so you could enjoy your lunch too. Thank you again. Again, reach out with questions either to your funding program administrator, your technical project manager, or us at the CRIP program. And otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gianna. Great overview.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good job, Gianna. Thank you.